that the very idea of contradiction is resisted by this culture here in the United States. It's not a comfortable concept. You don't hear people saying in a casual way that everything has a plus and a minus, and they're all wrapped up together, and it is not easy to disentangle so that you get a sense of it's going in this direction, but it is not at the same time. That seems very disturbing. I don't know what that's about. I know it has something to do with the religious Puritanism that the Europeans brought with them here. I know that it has to do with a kind of cultural guilt, a collectively burdened notion that the country was built on the basis of ethnic cleansing of the native indigenous population, which was simply exterminated. People who wonder why the United States stands behind Israel. Well, there are many reasons, no question. But one of them is the fact that Israel is doing now what the United States knows it did not so long ago, which is to exterminate the people that it doesn't want to have to deal with who are here. And so in this country, you don't get an awareness of the contradictions. So let me give you now an example. Capitalism is in deepening trouble here in the United States. I'll be glad to go through with you, if you're interested, all the pieces of evidence that strike me as leading to that conclusion. But at the same time, if by capitalism you mean, as I do, the organization of production between an employer and an employee, that way of organizing, which is both different from slavery or feudalism, importantly different, but also, here goes again, also like those. Masters are few and slaves are many, and lords are few and serfs are many, and employers are few and employees are many. You ought to think about that when you think about it. It doesn't mean that the French Revolution didn't mark the end of feudalism and the arrival of a new system, but the contradiction, it's different, but it is also the same, helps you see what you might otherwise miss. Right now, the employer-employee relationship is stunningly successful in China. And this is not an endorsement of China. I understand China has its problems and its contradictions plenty. But if the world in the last 2 centuries has been busy crawling out from under colonialism as the way the world was organized, it then follows that the overwhelming mass of people living in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have as their probable number one priority not being poor anymore, or to say it differently, achieving economic development as rapidly as they can. Well, then China is the success story. There's really no issue here. If you're looking for a model, that's where you would go. You might want to choose something else if you have some special other reason or you have different values. That's possible. But if and to the extent that you want a dynamic, growing capitalism, the very thing that the United States throughout the 20th century boasted it had achieved relative, say, to Europe, well, then now you have to move to China. You have to understand that capitalism is dynamic there and it is not here. And the signs of it are everywhere. This morning, we all woke up here in the United States to a new study which shows that the CEO of the Starbucks coffee chain has earns per year over 6,000 times more than the median employee of Starbucks earns. And why is that important? Because it's emblematic, and the research shows that we are living in a society which has the same remarkable continuity over the last 30 years that China has. In China, the continuity is an annual growth rate of GDP in the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% range. And the United States has nothing remotely like that. We're lucky here if we get 2%. Okay. But equally impressive is the growing inequality of the United States. You know, at the end of World War II, we were less unequal than Europe. Now we have left Europe in the dust in the level of inequality that we have, income inequality, wealth inequality. So it's a capitalism that is unable to do here in the United States what it promised its people across the 20th century. And I really am evidence of that. That's what they taught us in the elementary school. That's what they taught us again in high school. That's what I learned at the university. And that's what I was told when I got my PhD in economics. That the remarkable thing about capitalism is the immense middle class it produced and it sustains. It's all gone now. The confidence is gone. The reality has completely changed. The middle class isn't there anymore. It's literally gone. It's so obvious that even our conventional politicians, who specialize in admitting nothing and saying nothing, attack each other on the grounds that their enemy is destroying the middle class, and their goal is to bring back the middle class. Everybody says it, nobody does it. It's a little bit like every president, I counted back, I believe 8 or 9, promised to bring manufacturing back to America. Every president, Republican, Democrat, promised it. Absolutely none of them did it. And it doesn't make any difference. The next election, they're busy promising it each other and attacking each other for not having done it, not recognizing the contradiction that they're all guilty of that situation. They have no way out, and there's none on the horizon. The shrinkage of the United States is evident wherever we turn. The spectacle of this last week, and I know you have been addressing it in your other programs, as you certainly should, but I want to make people understand 2 spectacles that took place in the Oval Office of President Trump. His inauguration back on the 20th of January, when he had sitting behind him not the leading generals, not the leading diplomats, not the leading athletes, not the leading poets. He had Zuckerberg and Jeffrey Bezos and Elon Musk. He had a semicircle of the richest people in the world sitting there, Americans sitting there. Well, earlier this week, he in the same office, the Oval Office, he has himself behind a desk, and half the leaders of Europe, Macron, Starmer, Merz, sitting there almost like children, begging, because that's what they were doing, not to be treated as disposable subordinates while he treated them as disposable subordinates, which is how the United States is treated. The United States cannot afford the role for Europe, and so they are demoting Europe. They don't have enough money to keep them in a very nice doghouse, so they're being pushed out of the nice doghouse into a cheap doghouse. They're being told what they're going to have to suffer with the tariff regime. They're going to have to suffer with much less support militarily. They're going to have to suffer with being dumped into the Ukraine disaster now that the United States doesn't want to play anymore because it has other fish to fry. These are signs both of the United States' difficulty, which is crucial here, and the fact that that means they are going to take advantage of everybody else. I spent a few weeks ago in Montreal, Canada, and I made a real effort to talk to as many Canadians as I can. They are in a state of shock. They never expected, ever, that they would be anything other than the very well-treated nephew of the United States, who would get nice presents, be treated very nicely, and the idea that they are being made to suffer all kinds of ways, they literally cannot understand what happened. They feel almost personally betrayed, which is a way of saying they didn't get the whole relationship. They don't understand why it has been so easy, so quick for Mr. Trump to do all of this. And of course, they don't want to face the reality that for Mr. Trump to be in the position he's in tells you already that the support in the United States for what he's doing was already there, just waiting for somebody who would do it, because it would be a political opportunity not to be missed. And that's what Mr. Trump and his allies have understood.
In the early 19th century, when Alexis de Tocqueville went to the United States, he made a comment that one of the reasons why democracy would work in the U.S. is because there was a lower concentration of wealth there as opposed to in Europe. Now, of course, things, as you suggested, have been turned a little bit on its head since those days. It doesn't mean that Europe doesn't have the same problem, but I think, we see that it's a more severe situation in the United States. But it doesn't seem only to be an American problem, though, the wider one. I mean, after this long period of globalization, it does undermine, it does put capitalism and in a hyperdrive, but it also seems to undermine its foundation, because usually governments, they do recognize that there's a tendency for capital to concentrate, which undermines this relationship with labor. So the role of a government is always to have some socialist policies to make sure labor isn't squeezed. But if you look in countries, for example, your family's background from France, they have a dilemma. Either in this globalized market, they can either cut benefits, cut salaries, or they can shut the doors to the factories, and because they can't compete with Bangladesh. So they're no longer in a position to help labor anymore. Instead, they have to give the capital owners the ability to rule however they will, and put the squeeze on labor in order to actually compete in this cut-through market. But I guess my point is, if this is what you do, you keep squeezing the people, the worker. How far can you do it before you have a consumer-driven economy where you don't have consumer with any purchasing power? I mean, is this the capitalism killing itself? How do you see this?
Well, let's go back to the beginning. The way I see this is, you know, everything is contradictory. Life is a matter of navigating, if I could use such a metaphor, your contradictions, not pretending that they aren't there, not pretending that you can simply go in one direction without that having contradictory effects. But we live in a country which I do think is a little different from Europe. We live in a country where there is a real strong belief in the ability of private capitalism to overcome all problems, to resolve all difficulties, to manage its own contradictions, if that's even admitted, without worrying. You are watching, by the way, right now in the United States, a spectacular movement that is fully contradictory. I mean, let me give you a couple of examples to drive it home. On the one hand, you are um, destroying most of the social programs that the federal government normally administers in this country that have developed over at least the last 150 years. He's abolishing the education department. He's abolishing the foreign aid department. He's abolishing all number, in the name of efficiency. Absolutely no one takes that seriously, but he and the rationale, we don't need the public. The private will take care of it. Yeah, but at the same time, he is imposing on the private market the greatest regime of tariffs imaginable, which is a refusal to allow the private market to function, is a notion that the government is appropriately intervening to literally change at least the price of every import. And if you know how capitalism works, if you change the prices of the imports, you're sooner or later going to change every price as the system adjusts. I don't know if you caught it, but last week they announced that instead of giving a grant to the Intel Corporation, which is collapsing, the government is going to take a 10% position. It's going to give the Intel Corporation an enormous amount of money, but to become a 10% owner of the Intel Corporation. Well, that's a departure. The government used to be governed by the rule you never do that. You never do that. Or if you do it, it has to be temporary. It has to be exceptional. It has to be enshrouded with qualifiers that make it not last. The government had to intervene in the crisis of 2008 massively. The government took over the major banks. The government took over the largest insurance company in the United States, and so on. But it was always spoken about as a temporary emergency, exceptional, and then undone as quickly as either Republicans or all of that's gone. The protectionism that the tariff war shows you is an act of desperation, especially when undertaken by people like this, who at the same time that they are intervening are getting rid of government agencies on the grounds that you don't need the government to do these things that the government is now doing more than ever. And that contradiction is obvious, but yet invisible. It may be obvious to you, but invisible to the American culture, and whether it's the New York Times or the others, they don't want to see it. And it's as true of the Democrats as it is of the Republicans, because they're all caught up in an inability to face any of this. When I said to you a few moments ago that there's a decline of the capitalism of the West, whereas it's doing very well in the East and the South. It's finding new areas to be very successful and to grow and to sink very deep roots, which, if you're a critic of capitalism, as I am, is not all good news, not at all. But it is clearly declining here. And I live in a culture in which the only way to describe the reaction in one word is denial. We live in a society which cannot face this. I do know, and I am part of the reason for it, I do know that there's more casual discussion of the United States as a declining empire, flirting all around the culture. You see it here, and that's new. We didn't have that 2-3 years ago. That's already happening, and I'm sure that will get greater. But the dominant view in this country, among particularly the elite that runs the country, is total denial. Irritation when someone says that. Why you say this silly? That's it. Dismissive. It's not. It's not an argument they feel the need to refute. That's an argument where you wave your hand and hope it goes away, so that no one should say it. Capitalism is dynamic. Do they worry that the entire stock market is based on literally 8 companies and their extraordinary rise in stocks? Google and Alphabet and all the rest. No, they worry about it. But do they see it as a problem? No. Do they worry about the inequality that is off the chart here? Yes. But do they understand what it means? No. I live in Manhattan, New York City. I'm speaking to you from there now. We just had an election in which the people of New York City, who are overwhelmingly in the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is dead here. It has no strength, no relevance. So if you win the primary, the election inside the Democratic Party for a major position, you pretty much automatically get it in the full election later because the people are overwhelmingly voting Democratic. So we are about to elect, and the polls are pretty strong now, a young, bearded Muslim man who supports the Palestinians. That was unimaginable 5 years ago, or for that matter, at any point in the last century. And I could go on and on. Things are happening and changing here that I never expected to live in my lifetime to see. And I'm a little, as you can tell, I'm a little overwhelmed by the strength of the accumulating evidence and the juxtaposition of that evidence and the bland denial. But then again, as good psychology teaches, one of the ways human beings cope with social change that is too much is a combination of denying it. That's one way of coping. And the other one is enacting a theater of pretense. In other words, act as though it weren't happening. Between that and denial, you can manage a response to it. And Mr. Trump is our primary theater actor in charge. He has to be the man, the powerful man. He had to arrange the chairs. So Mr. Macron has to look up at him and Mr. Starmer, and they all have to come and ask. You had, I believe, your NATO a spokesperson a few weeks ago refer to him as Papa.
Danny,
Yeah, I mean, by itself, of course, it's not important. But in the context, I'm telling you, nobody missed it here. This was a moment of great success. And telling the Europeans that Ukraine is their problem is for him rising up above the Europeans, telling them what to do. But I know, speaking to you, I don't mean to hurt anyone's feelings, but there is about American policy now the flavor of a powerful person with enormous contempt for the people subordinate to himself. It's almost as though, as the arrangement dissolves, the antipathy, the contempt for those below can be articulated. And it reflects, which the Europeans will enjoy, it reflects, of course, the long and deeply felt inferiority complex of the ex-colony, that it isn't as developed as La France or Deutschland or Great Britain. So you have that mixture of envy and bitterness, and what's coming out now is a lot of that because it's part of the theater. If we are better than Europe, then we have in some way achieved the reversal that the whole history of the United States was rehearsing to finally be able to do. And Mr. Trump plays, whether he's aware of it or not, I don't know. I don't care. But he plays on that thematic all the time.